a married man impregnated someone else, and something happened when his wife found out. You won't believe what she did. Let's go on this journey together. The story begins with Francis, who came back from school looking sad. His mother noticed and asked him why he was upset, but he refused to share the reason. She then told him she had prepared his favorite meal and asked him to eat, but he declined and walked away. Meanwhile, it was Dorinda's birthday. Her father had promised to take her out, but he didn't show up, leaving her deeply hurt and disappointed. Mr. Whale, Dorinda's father, had gone to his home instead to spend time with his wife and son. They were all happy to see him, and after some time, they sat at the dining table, eating and chatting. Francis congratulated his father on securing a big contract, and the family continued their lively discussion over the meal. Dorinda, still at home, felt devastated when she realized her father had completely forgotten her birthday. At that moment, she felt unloved and ignored. Later that night, Mr. Whale checked his phone and saw several missed calls and voice messages from Dorinda's mother, Chisholm. Just as he was contemplating whether to respond, his wife walked in and urged him to rest since he had just returned from a trip. He got up and they went to bed together. The next morning, Mr. Whale went to see Dorinda. He met Chisholm and apologized for missing Dorinda's birthday. However, Chisholm was furious and told him to talk to Dorinda directly. He then spoke to Dorinda, apologized, and promised to get her anything she wanted to make up for her birthday. Dorinda was finally happy again. That night, Mr. Whale sat in his restroom, reflecting on what Chisholm had told him, that she was tired of him being absent in Dorinda's life. He wondered how long he could continue living a double life, managing two families, and keeping it a secret. Meanwhile, Francis was in his room, worried about his studies because he didn't understand mathematics. His father believed he was good at it because Francis always paid someone to do his assignments for him. When his father walked in, Francis quickly pretended to be solving math problems. His father was impressed and proud of him, and they chatted for a while before his dad left. That same night, Chisholm kept trying to reach Mr. Whale, but he wasn't answering her calls. Dorinda, too, felt unhappy because she hadn't heard from her dad. The next morning, Mr. Whale and his family were having breakfast. They were discussing a man who had a second wife outside his marriage. Francis confidently said that his dad could never be like that, and his mother agreed, praising her husband as a different kind of man. Mr. Whale, however, sat quietly, staring at them. If only they knew the truth. While they were talking, Mr. Whale received a call from a stranger, informing him that Chisholm had been in an accident and had died on the spot. Shocked, he screamed, alarming his wife, who immediately asked what was wrong. He simply told her he needed to go out and quickly left. When Mr. Whale arrived at the scene, he found everyone crying. Later that day, Dorinda returned from school, unaware of the tragedy, and assumed her mother was just sleeping. That night, Mr. Whale's wife grew worried because he hadn't returned home and wasn't answering her calls. Eventually, she received a message from him saying he was fine, but wouldn't be coming home that night. The following evening, Mr. Whale was sitting on the couch when his wife approached him. She consoled him after he lied to her, claiming that a friend of his had just lost his wife. Feeling pity, she even cried for the grieving family and told him she wanted to pay her condolences. However, Mr. Whale lied again, saying the family had already traveled. Determined, his wife decided she would attend the burial with him. But once more, he lied, claiming he had a 3-day business trip coming up, leaving her with no choice but to drop the idea. 2 months later, Mr. Whale went to visit his daughter, Dorinda, who was staying with her maternal aunt. Dorinda was overjoyed to see her dad and begged to go home with him. He promised to come back and pick her up soon, which made her happy. After Dorinda left, her guardian told Mr. Whale that he had 1 week to come for Dorinda, urging him to resolve whatever issues he had with his family. He assured her he would. That evening, Mr. Whale gathered his family and confessed that he had a child outside the marriage, and that the child's mother had recently passed away. The revelation shocked his wife, who cried bitterly, feeling deeply betrayed. Francis was equally disappointed and hurt. Mr. Whale tried to console his wife, pleading for her forgiveness, but she was devastated. Learning that Dorinda was already 8 years old made it worse. She realized he had been unfaithful for 8 long years. She told him she would not allow a stranger's child under her roof and stormed out. The next morning, as Mr. Whale prepared for work, his family completely ignored him, leaving him speechless. That same day, Mr. Whale went to pick up Dorinda. On the way, he explained everything she needed to know about his wife and son. Dorinda, though surprised, quickly pieced things together and realized he had been married to someone else all along. Despite the shock, Dorinda, being a smart girl, understood the situation. When they arrived at Mr. Whale's home, no one welcomed Dorinda, which surprised her. Mr. Whale explained that they were still mourning her mother, which was why they weren't warm toward her. He showed her to her room, and she was excited. Dorinda asked if her mother had ever been to the house, but her father admitted she hadn't. Understanding the reason, she realized there might be trouble with her arrival. Mr. Whale encouraged her, calling her a strong girl. Dorinda confided that she missed her mother and broke down in tears. Her father hugged her and comforted her. However, Mr. Whale's wife and son refused to accept Dorinda. They ignored her, refused to share meals with her, and didn't care whether she had eaten, which deeply hurt the little girl. The next morning, Whale informed Francis that he would enroll Dorinda in the primary school near his own school, and that Francis would bring her home afterward. Francis refused and spoke rudely to his father, which almost made Mr. Whale hit him. Furious, Francis ran to his mother and complained. Inside, Mr. Whale pleaded with his wife to accept Dorinda as her daughter, but she refused, calling Dorinda a bastard and saying cruel things. Francis joined in, making hurtful comments. Dorinda overheard the argument and ran to her room in tears. The next morning, Dorinda woke up early to prepare for school and wrote in her diary, expressing hope that her new mom and brother would one day accept her. She then opened her wardrobe to get her uniform, but couldn't find it. Meanwhile, Mr. Whale, on his way to work, found her uniform outside, soaked by the rain. He scolded Francis because he had specifically asked him to bring it inside. But Francis showed no remorse, coldly declaring that Dorinda was not his sister. Enraged, Mr. Whale handed Francis the wet uniform and ordered him to dry it. That day, Dorinda was very hungry, but her stepmother refused to give her food. When Dorinda tried to take a snack, her stepmother shouted at her, leaving her frightened and upset. Later, Dorinda went to Francis' room to apologize for telling one of his friends that he was her brother. However, Francis treated her cruelly, and she left feeling hurt. The next morning, Francis suggested that Dorinda should take the school bus instead of him bringing her home, but Mr. Whale refused. He insisted he didn't want Dorinda to feel lonely. Francis, however, persisted, saying he didn't want the responsibility. Left with no choice, Mr. Whale agreed, but was clearly unhappy with the decision. That evening, Mr. Whale went to Francis's room to plead with him to accept Dorinda as his sister. He explained how lonely she had been. Francis, expecting his father to scold him for his behavior, was surprised when he learned Dorinda hadn't said anything about how badly he had treated her. That night, Mr. Whale once again pleaded with his wife to accept Dorinda, but she ignored him, leaving the family in a state of emotional turmoil. That same day, Mr. Whale sat down with Francis to explain how Dorinda came into their lives. He admitted that during a difficult time in his marriage, when his wife withheld intimacy, he felt hurt and frustrated. One evening, he went to a bar to clear his head, and a woman approached him. They talked, and one thing led to another. Months later, she told him she was pregnant. Although he asked her to terminate the pregnancy, she refused. After conducting a DNA test to confirm Dorinda was his child, he took responsibility for her. Mr. Whale pleaded with Francis again to be kind to Dorinda. Later that day, Francis went to the kitchen to drink water. When Dorinda saw him, she turned back to leave. Francis remarked that it was good to know she was scared of him. However, Dorinda confidently replied that she wasn't afraid of him. She explained she hadn't told their dad about his behavior because she saw him as her elder brother, and siblings should always have each other's backs. Her words surprised Francis, and he quietly left the kitchen. The next day, Dorinda came back from school, but her stepmother refused to open the door for her. Exhausted, she fell asleep outside. When Francis returned home from school, he found her outside, picked her up, and carried her inside. He told his mother that Dorinda was just a child and didn't deserve to bear the brunt of her frustrations. His mother shouted at him, but Frances ignored her and took Dorinda to her room. The next morning, as Dorinda prepared for school, Frances barged into her room without knocking. Dorinda asked him to knock, which he reluctantly did, signaling a slight improvement in their relationship. Frances noticed she was searching for something and asked what it was. Dorinda said she was looking for her socks, and Frances immediately found them in her wardrobe. She was surprised, as she had been searching for them for a while. As he helped her put on her socks, Dorinda asked why he was paying someone to do his math assignments. She suggested that he start a tutoring class if he struggled with mathematics. Then she added, "Who will help you during your math exams?" This question visibly upset Frances, and he walked away, telling her to hurry up. That evening, Dorinda was doing her homework in the living room when her stepmother entered. Nervous, Dorinda quickly packed her books and ran to her room, but she tripped, dropping her diary. Her stepmother picked it up and read it. In the diary, Dorinda had written about how much she loved her stepmother, despite not receiving the same love in return. Moved by the words, her stepmother broke down in tears, regretting how she had treated Dorinda. Later, her stepmother went to Dorinda's room to apologize. Dorinda forgave her and also asked her to forgive her late mother. Touched by Dorinda's maturity, her stepmother hugged her, marking a new beginning in their relationship. That evening, Mr. Whale searched for Dorinda, but couldn't find her. He asked Frances, who also didn't know where she was. Worried, they asked the gateman, who informed them he had seen Dorinda and her stepmother leaving the house. This alarmed them, as they feared the worst. Moments later, they heard a car horn. The gateman opened the gate, and they saw Dorinda and her stepmother returning in harmony, carrying shopping bags. Dorinda's stepmother asked them to help with the bags, and Mr. Whale was overjoyed to see that she had finally accepted Dorinda. That night, Mr. Whale pleaded with his wife again, and this time, she fully accepted Dorinda as part of their family. They embraced warmly. The next day, Frances and his father were talking when his dad brought up the issue of Frances paying someone to do his math assignments. Shocked, Frances immediately assumed Dorinda had told him. When Dorinda later tried to hug him, he pushed her away, leaving her confused. Frances went to sit by the pool, and Dorinda followed him to ask what was wrong. He ignored her and tried to leave, but accidentally fell into the pool. Since he had a phobia of water, he couldn't swim. Everyone panicked, including his mother, but Dorinda quickly jumped in and saved him. Later, in the living room, Frances accused Dorinda of telling their father about his math assignments. His mother intervened, explaining that she was the one who had informed his dad, not Dorinda. Realizing his mistake, Frances apologized to Dorinda, and they hugged. Mr. Whale, who had overheard everything, came in and thanked Dorinda for saving Frances. He also decided to hire a swimming instructor for Frances, and Dorinda jokingly offered to teach them herself for 5,000 naira per minute. Her joke made everyone laugh. Later that day, Mr. Whale encouraged Frances, telling him it was never too late to learn mathematics. He promised to tutor him daily. Frances, feeling supported, hugged his dad. The next morning, Frances woke up to find that Dorinda had painted his face with makeup while he was asleep. He looked hilariously strange. Furious, he shouted her name as she ran off laughing. And that's how the story ended, guys. Thanks for following this amazing journey in my world of movies. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories. See you in our next movie.